So I have almost like a question that kind of maybe I'll ask you to think about almost the opposite of this, which is many times I take works that I like a lot, and not that I necessarily try to do this, but I'll notice things about them that I don't like or I that don't work, yet they feel very intentional. And I know we've done this as well, talking about certain games on the podcast and elsewhere, but things that don't feel intentional, but that are precisely successful within the vision of the creator or author or artist or whatever, but they fail maybe for me. Almost like I have a different kind of understanding of the whole that doesn't really that either doesn't work with the whole that I'm given, or I just disagree that that thing in question works with the whole that I'm given. So I was just wondering if you like think about this at all, because the more looking over your book again, there's a lot more kind of like meta-critical stuff going on that I find really interesting. And so this like critical gesture that you set out here, but also the one that I'm kind of describing, which is almost the opposite. I wonder if that's something that happens for you a lot when you're playing games. Like do you tend to focus on those moments that seem disjunctive in a way that's like not critically productive quite as much?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think the my obsession with aesthetic faults and the way in which they breed interpretation, or breed commentary, or rather just supercharge commentary, comes out of a sort of even more fundamental orientation towards faults and a kind of obsessiveness about things that bother me, right? That seem imperfect in works or things that I like the way you put it. That seem like it's not that there are mistakes because the author or artist clearly intended them, but I don't like what was intended. Um, that is an element of artistic failure, so to speak, that I don't really treat in Bloodborne. I don't know if there's anywhere where I just say, this thing just sucks, like I don't like this thing. Um, there are, I mean, like I think, well, then let me circle back to Bloodborne. I would say that yes, I tend to just fixate on those things, and I'm actually playing right now. I was literally before this podcast, I stopped a stream of Metal Gear Solid Delta, which is the brand new re-release of Metal Gear Solid 3. And it's essentially a glorified remaster. Like they kept it's the same game, just with a new camera angle and redone in Unreal 5. Um, and so I keep noticing these things in the remaster that were there in the original that I obsessively played. I mean, Metal Gear Solid 3 was my OG favorite game. And so I know it front to back. I like know it. I truly know it by heart. And playing now, I'm struck, after having not played it for a long time, like my attention keeps catching at these things that as a teenager I used to be like, I don't think that worked. That's like I wish that wasn't in the game. Like that's kind of stupid. Or that just like even something as small as like a one way of a single line delivery, from one of the actors, or like something included in a shot, in a discrete sort of virtual shot from the virtual camera. I would just be like, why didn't they cut that out? Like that actually actively makes this scene worse. It makes this game worse. Um, so yeah, like I would say that I often have a hard time appreciating things, really. I try really hard to appreciate, to sort of have to train myself to appreciate things, especially things that I really care about when they have these kind of like nagging flaws that don't, maybe they aren't even instances of negative form. They're just like stuff that I don't, that just doesn't seem to work for me. Um, I think I said earlier with like total conviction that Bloodborne has that stuff too. Um, I'm now trying to recall some examples. To be honest, haven't played the game in like 3 years. I played a little bit of it streamed a little bit last winter, but um, maybe I'll break the seal on one of my other bits that I didn't put into the book, but that, if I were to rewrite it, I might try to shoehorn in somewhere. This is just like one of those things. It is a kind of negative form, it's a bit more enigmatic, it's a bit more mysterious. So it's kind of more of a piece with the sort of things that I'm discussing in the book. But it still ultimately just feels like an artistic choice that I don't agree with, which is that unless I'm wrong or unless I'm just badly misreading an environmental texture or effect, have you noticed that there's this one area in Hemwick Charnel Lane? So like Hemwick Charnel Lane is like the kind of witches village. It's like very Resident Evil 4. Um, and it's a kind of outskirt to Yarnum, a rural outskirt to Yarnum, where you have to sort of weave through these like thatch, sort of like village huts, and then kind of like these sort of decrepit barns. But at one point, right near the end, you get to this valley. And if you look down into the valley, it actually, so I'm going by memory here. I haven't checked this in a while, but I took a note of this when I was playing the game for the book, like kind of very deliberately and slowly playing the game. If you look down into the valley, you can see that it looks almost like the whole area is suspended in the air. You know, that there's actually like a white void underneath Hemwick Charnel Lane that is explicitly being represented as such. So of course, you know, there's something meta here, and again, this is the sort of thing that Souls does really well, is that all game levels are suspended in a void, more or less. You know, so actually what's unnatural or what needs to be faked is the idea that it would be assimilated into a continuous natural landscape. And Hemwick Charnel Lane, in a large part, is. It's like the one place in the game, or one of the few places where you can see Canehurst Castle, for instance. You can see Yarnum. You can see also the areas outside of Yarnum that are traversable within the game. You kind of get a panoramic view of the entirety of the region, not just of the city. But at the same time, you also have this one area where it kind of like reveals the truth of the game and this area itself, which is like you have this weird void, you know, that's just very visible. Um, and so I just have always wondered, or since then I've wondered, like, what was the intentionality there? Like, couldn't you have at least like changed the filter a little bit so it just looked like a foggy valley, you know, a misty valley? Like, why make it so clear that there's nothing down there, you know, that in fact this whole landscape is just floating out there in nothingness. Um, my thought for if I were to relate this to the book was this sort of it's a little bit like maybe convoluted or at least a little bit esoteric. I think for a game audience, definitely not for a literary audience. But I wanted to relate it to the Castle of Otranto, which is the first Gothic novel, where there's this funny thing where the Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole was sort of famed in its time, and even someone like Mikhail Bakhtin, you know, writes about how vividly the castle setting crystallizes for the reader. It's like I feel like I'm in the castle. You know, the castle is just like basically invented or at least popularized the trope of like the haunted castle as something interesting, as something full of narrative possibility. Um, but if you actually read the text, like the castle and the setting itself are essentially non-existent. And by that I just mean there's no physical description of the space. So all description of what's happening in the physical reality of the Castle of Otranto comes from the characters saying, "Hey, look at that thing over there." You know, so character will be like, "Oh my God, there's a giant floating suit of armor." You know, but there's no like narrator saying a huge floating suit of armor appear. You know, like or it's incredibly terse, incredibly cursory in the way that there's objective representation of the environment. So actually, the castle is something conjured out of dialogue and conjured out of a weird kind of pointing, rather than having a sort of like ontological solidity established by the neutral narrative voice. And what that leads to is this very like this strong feeling of immateriality when you're reading The Castle of Otranto. Um, I mean, on a basic level, this is because space is functioning as it does in theater and not as it does in a novel. Is what we now recognize according to novelistic convention. Space is being, you know, in theater, space is also conjured. You know, someone goes, "Look at that," right? And you don't need to have like a special effect. We just have all the characters gaping, right, and pointing at something. But when it's happening in a book that you're reading, it is a weird effect, and it just makes it seem essentially like the castle is a void. That the castle is like this infinite space of possibility where nothing is fixed, nothing is set, and anything can be conjured ex nihilo, like at any point in the action. Um, and so I thought, like, you know, I had this sort of reading where this moment in Henwick Charnel Lane is like paying homage, you know, I think clearly unintentional homage, but paying homage to the root of the Gothic genre by sort of playing on the idea that all space is really a void and that all environment is just this kind of space of pure possibility. And really, the designers are like, hey, we're just showing you that we can do anything with the space. So this is all imaginary space and we can fuck it up or we can add things as we want. But at the end of the day, it's really just it's an abyss of nothingness. Um, so that was my connection. I write about Frankenstein, I write about Dracula. I tried to play the hits, in this book, even though it's not super foregrounded. But, obviously Lovecraft is the central figure, but also Frankenstein and Dracula appear. Um, and I was going to bring in the Castle of Otranto, but I ended up just cutting that. Anyway, that's a very long, again, I'm being very long-winded today, but that's a somewhat lengthy answer to how I might justify, like artistically justify that choice. But at the end of the day, I want to say, having said all of that and having chosen not to write that chapter and include it, that I just don't like that choice. It just seems like it totally violates one of the things that makes Yharnam special, which is precisely that it feels so real, in contradistinction to the Nightmare Worlds. So we already have the Nightmare Realms. We have the Nightmare of Mentis, we have the Hunter's Nightmare, we have the Nightmare Frontier, and then we have the Hunter's Dream. Um, we have areas that are very explicitly floating in voids, and where spatial rules are totally messed up, and that's what makes Yharnam feel special. And what makes, it makes Yharnam feel special because it's so grounded. It feels like such a real place with a kind of physical solidity and certainty. And on the flip side, it makes those nightmare realms feel special because they're so spatially disjunctive in contradistinction to the kind of main environment of the game. And this was a case where like the distinction is blurring and getting watered down, in a way that I find just like aesthetically deeply unsatisfying.